A mailroom worker accidentally undertakes a travel writing assignment to the Bermuda Triangle. He is then transported to a strange island, encountering people much smaller than him. A man wakes up and spiritedly gets ready for his day. He looks wistfully at a poster of a beautiful house on his wall before leaving for work. The man, Lemuel Gulliver, works at a newspaper mailroom and takes the new hire, Dan, around the office. Gulliver is taken aback when Dan speaks to one of the senior employees, later telling the new hire that little people like him should keep their heads down. They then come across an attractive travel editor, Darcy, who Gulliver is smitten with. Dan quickly picks up on this and teases Gulliver, but the latter bluffs that he can ask Darcy out anytime as they head to the elevator. However, Darcy walks into their elevator, and Dan gets out to give Gulliver his shot. All the talk pretty much drains from Gulliver, unable to carry a decent conversation with the kindly Darcy. That night, Dan correctly guesses that Gulliver squirreled out of asking Darcy out. Dan also breaks the news that he's replacing Gulliver as the new head of the mailroom. The new hire further belittles Gulliver's funny guy reputation, saying he'll never be bigger than a 10-year mailroom worker. Afterward, Gulliver drops by Darcy, working late in her office, and attempts yet again to ask her out. He fails to follow through and instead accidentally takes a travel writing assignment on her desk. A surprised Darcy encourages Gulliver to submit a sample the next morning, praising his initiative. That night in his apartment, Gulliver struggles to write a single word for his sample. Desperate, he resorts to plagiarizing text off a travel website and a book. The next day, Darcy is impressed by Gulliver's samples, noticing how his varied style reminds her of certain travel publications. She decides to give him a real assignment that requires boating to the Bermuda Triangle, which Gulliver accepts half-heartedly. Gulliver flies to the island of Bermuda, where a man named Hank drives him to the dock. Hank reassures an anxious Gulliver that the Bermuda Triangle stories only serve to hawk merchandise to tourists. Hank then instructs Gulliver on how to use the GPS on his boat to go to the triangle and back to the dock. Gulliver sets off on the boat not for sale, documenting his experience on a tape recorder and taking breaks to read a hobby magazine. Having fallen asleep, Gulliver doesn't notice the GPS has failed and wakes up to a raging storm rocking the boat. So Gulliver puts on multiple floaties and tries to dial 911 on his phone, only to see there's no service. At the same time, a gigantic ocean vortex sweeps the boat up and into its depths, taking a screaming Gulliver with it. Sometime later, Gulliver wakes up and finds himself tied up by an army of miniature people the size of his fingers. Their leader, General Edward Edwardian, labels him a beast and accuses him of aiding their enemies, the Blefutians. Freaking out, Gulliver screams and breaks free of the restraints as the small people scramble in panic. While Gulliver is in denial of what's happening, Edward throws a spear at his foot and orders his men to subdue the giant. The tiny soldiers throw hooks onto Gulliver and pull him down by the pants, causing him to lose his balance and hit his head, eventually passing out. Afterward, Gulliver is tied back down and wheeled into a miniature city teeming with people who are awestruck by his size. The soldiers then pull Gulliver upright to face King Theodore and his family. Fielding accusations of being a Blefutian spy, Gulliver asks to know where he is. One of the royal aides informs him that he is in a land called Lilliput. Hours later, Gulliver is chained inside a cavernous dungeon as the Lilliputians try to feed him hay. He befriends a fellow prisoner and Lilliputian named Horatio, who was locked up for making advances on Edward's fiancée, Princess Mary. Gulliver is outraged, but Horatio explains that because of his lowly stature, he can only win the princess' hand through valiant acts. Edward appears just as Gulliver insults him but manages to trick the general into believing it was flattery. When Gulliver asks if he can be let go, Edward instead relegates him to hard labor. While Edward controls Gulliver via a special contraption to plow their fields, a ship with red sails deploys a group of divers just beyond Lilliput's waters. The invaders then set one of the barns on fire to distract protection away from the princess. Shortly after, Edward and Horatio immediately identify from the warning bells that it's a Blefutian attack. Edward redirects Gulliver toward the castle just as the Blefutian soldiers reach the princess in her tower. Upon arriving at the castle, Edward refuses Gulliver's offer to help and rushes inside. Horatio, on the other hand, pleads with Gulliver to help rescue the princess and releases him from the contraption. Gulliver swiftly saves Princess Mary from the Blefutians by dropping them into the pond and beating Edward to the punch. The giant takes the princess to safety, much to Horatio's relief. But more warning bells indicate that the spreading fire threatens the king's life. Gulliver strides over to the room where King Theodore and his aide are trapped but burns himself trying to breach the window. Horatio, together with the princess, catches up and tells Gulliver he'll need huge amounts of water to put out the fire. Gulliver then pulls down his pants and urinates all over the blaze, including the king. When the fire is extinguished, Edward arrives and starts cursing Gulliver, but the latter turns around and douses the blustering general with urine as well. The king comes out relatively unharmed and proclaims Gulliver their savior, prompting the Lilliputians to celebrate him. Later, the king invites Gulliver to a royal banquet that evening via his aide. Gulliver agrees if Horatio gets pardoned and accompanies him to the party. His request is granted, much to Horatio's elation, and the two bump fists. That night at the banquet, Horatio and Princess Mary exchange glances while Queen Isabel asks Gulliver where he's from. The king speculates if he's from the island where we dare not go, but Gulliver clarifies he's from Manhattan, where there are no kings but rather presidents. When the queen and princess assume he is the president of Manhattan, Gulliver goes along and pads his noble backstory a bit more. An irritated Edward asks when he plans to leave, and Gulliver says he's stuck in Lilliput until he finds his boat. The king assures Gulliver they'll find his boat, offering to build him a place to sleep in the meantime. 7 days later, the Lilliputians manage to build Gulliver a luxurious home identical to the poster on his apartment wall. Afterward, Gulliver and the Lilliputians watch dramatic recreations of famous movies, all with Gulliver as the protagonist. Edward tries to remind the king of their military exercises, but the royals are too engrossed in the stories. One afternoon, Gulliver asks Horatio about his progress with Princess Mary, and Horatio estimates there might be a chance in about 4 years. Incredulous, Gulliver advises that waiting that long isn't feasible and offers to help Horatio court the princess. The next day, Horatio calls to Princess Mary at her tower, wooing her with sweet words repeated from Gulliver hiding behind a wall. Gulliver coaches Horatio into spouting pop song lyrics, which completely enthralls the princess. However, Princess Mary abruptly leaves upon hearing someone in her room, who turns out to be Edward. The general expresses distrust for Gulliver and makes feeble attempts at courtship, to the princess' dismay. That night, Edward informs Gulliver that his men have found the knot for sale. At the beach, Gulliver does find the boat broken in half, looking forward to getting it repaired and telling Darcy about his findings. He also recovers his phone, which still works and contains 12 voice messages, all from an angry Darcy. To Gulliver's horror, Darcy found out that he plagiarized the writing samples, warning him to stay hidden after sailing to find him in Bermuda. Meanwhile, Edward spots a robot diagram from the magazine half buried in the sand. Gulliver walks away sadly as the general happily informs him that the boat will be ready by the end of the week. Back at the castle courtyard, Princess Mary comforts Gulliver about his princess, referring to Darcy. She also confesses to developing feelings for Horatio but has second thoughts due to her betrothal to Edward. Gulliver spurs her to follow her heart, then wonders if he could stay in Lilliput for a while longer. The princess assures him that everyone would be glad to see him stay. Hearing this news the next day, Edward rants to the king about his distrust of Gulliver and his sudden change of mind. Perceiving the general to be stressed, King Theodore advises him to take time off his duties and proceeds to make Gulliver the new general. During a ceremony conferring the title to Gulliver, he taunts Edward by referring to the latter's relegation to vice general. Fuming, Edward deactivates Lilliput's defense systems afterward, prompting the Blefutians to launch a naval attack. Learning of the invasion from Horatio, Gulliver makes for the beach, where Edward and the king observe the Blefutian armada advancing. Edward assigns Gulliver to wipe out the entire fleet of enemy ships, expecting him to fail. After removing his shirt and shoes, Gulliver approaches the Blefutian fleet and beckons them to make a show of battling each other to avoid casualties. However, the Blefutian king, Leopold, orders the ships to encircle Gulliver and fire their cannons at him. The barrage hits Gulliver all over his torso, but his plump body causes the cannonballs to bounce back to the fleet. Gulliver then drags away the ships by their anchor ropes as the Lilliputians rejoice in his victory. In the following days, Gulliver enjoys his celebrated life on Lilliput by playing games, designing city squares, and getting massages. He even gets a uniform signifying his rank as General of Lilliput. One day, while they play a game, Horatio reminds Gulliver that, as general, he should be training the army to defend Lilliput against the Blefutians. Gulliver dismisses his worries and instead coaches Horatio on how to win Princess Mary's heart. That night, after Edward walks into Princess Mary's chambers without permission again, she breaks off their engagement. They get into a heated argument when the princess brings up Gulliver's unfavorable opinion of Edward. He then issues threats and walks out, only to find Gulliver's face plastered all over the New York-style city square. Fed up with his situation, Edward defects to Blefuscia, informing King Leopold that he intends to destroy Lilliput to save it and Blefuscia from Gulliver's influence. When asked how he aims to accomplish his task, Edward brings in the magazine page with instructions on building a robot. Back in Lilliput, Gulliver leads the citizens in celebrating a concert-like party called Lillipalooza. Meanwhile, Horatio's aloof attitude, as instructed by Gulliver, upsets Princess Mary, who slaps him before leaving. Suddenly, the bells alert Lilliput to another Blefuscian attack, which Gulliver cockily engages. A trash-can-looking machine piloted by Edward rolls in, challenging Gulliver to a duel, which he accepts. The machine then transforms into a hulking robot that towers over Gulliver, who can't even budge the heavy frame. Edward pushes Gulliver and lifts him up by his undergarment, forcing the guy to surrender. King Theodore, Princess Mary, and Horatio remind Gulliver of his heroic feats, but the giant admits to lying about everything. Edward then orders Gulliver's banishment to the island where we dare not go. Strapped to a raft, Gulliver is taken to the waters and left drifting through the dense fog in the ocean. Later, Gulliver wakes up on another strange island where he sees a gigantic house on a rocky hill. Suddenly, a mason jar wielded by a giant hand swings down to capture him. Meanwhile, the Blefuscians complete their invasion of Lilliput. Horatio sneaks into a garden to meet Princess Mary, but she brushes him off, lumping him together with Gulliver as a liar. At the beach, Darcy wakes up to find miniature people crawling all over and restraining her. A reinstated General Edward introduces himself as commander of New Blefuscia, Lilliput's new name. Horatio sees this and rushes off to inform Gulliver as Edward identifies Darcy from one of Gulliver's stories. Gulliver wakes up dressed like a doll in a strangely toy-like room. The room trembles, and a wall opens up to reveal a giant girl looking at him. As it turns out, Gulliver is in a dollhouse inside the room of a gigantic, old-fashioned house. The giant girl plays with Gulliver and makes him interact with the other toys in rough ways. That night, he finds what seems like a toy dressed as a pilot seated at the tea table. Gulliver is shocked to see a human skull under the helmet, implying that actual people have perished while trapped in the giant house. Traveling by boat, Horatio reaches the giant island and makes contact with Gulliver in the dollhouse. Shaking Gulliver from his self-pitying state, Horatio tells him of Blefuscia's invasion and Darcy's capture. Gulliver realizes Darcy went through the Bermuda Triangle to complete his assignment. Gulliver then explains how pretending to be a big shot to the Lilliputians gave him a rare confidence boost. Horatio rallies Gulliver by reminding him of his heroic acts, like saving the princess and defeating the Blefuscian armada. Citing their true friendship, Horatio finally convinces Gulliver to help save Lilliput. Gulliver steals a parachute from the pilot's corpse and glides out of the giant's house with Horatio. That night, Gulliver finds Darcy in the dungeon, along with King Theodore and Queen Isabel, locked up in a cell. With the king and queen's awkward aid, Gulliver manages to confess his attraction to Darcy. She finds it sweet but asks him to focus on getting off the island. Gulliver, however, intends on saving Lilliput first, having grown fond of its people. He then breaks down the cell door and pleads with the king to allow him to be their protector once more. The next day, Gulliver challenges Edward and his robot, in full view of the kings of Lilliput and Blefuscia. Gulliver cuts a deal with the arrogant general to free Lilliput if he wins. Edward agrees, threatening Lilliput's destruction should Gulliver fail. They square off, with Edward showcasing the robot's new electric weapon in addition to its raw power. Seeing Gulliver fall, Horatio races to help his friend by riding behind the robot and swinging up its hatch with a rope. Horatio attacks Edward from within the machine, even as Gulliver is thrown against a building. Horatio sabotages the robot's electric weapon, allowing Gulliver to gain the upper hand with a drop kick. As Horatio falls from the robot, Gulliver continues to attack the machine with a statue and a few more wrestling moves. Knocking the robot to the ground, Gulliver pulls out its wiring and deactivates it. Darcy and the Lilliputians cheer his victory as Horatio emerges from the crowd and sincerely apologizes to Princess Mary, confessing his love for her. King Theodore interrupts them to declare Horatio's valiant act and give his blessing. Horatio and the princess kiss while Gulliver signals his approval. Edward appears out of nowhere and attempts to take the princess away, but she twists his arm and knocks him out with a well-placed punch. At the same time, Darcy interrupts Gulliver's apology with a sweeping kiss. The two kings start to bicker and threaten war, but Gulliver cuts them off, transitioning into another pop song. Gulliver then unites the Lilliputians and Blefuscians through the power of song and dance. Sometime later, Gulliver and Darcy leave Lilliput in their boat as Princess Mary comforts a crying Horatio. Back in Manhattan months later, Gulliver is now a travel writer reporting to his girlfriend, Darcy. Dan, still head of the mailroom, introduces them to the new mail guy. Gulliver and Darcy then curtsy playfully as they walk out of the office for lunch.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.